Arkansas native Denele Campbell tracks her family's roots in the state back to the early 1800s and credits this history for her love of homegrown tomatoes and hoot owls late at night. After college and a few years on the West Coast, Campbell and her then-husband settled on a tick-infested Ozark hilltop to raise 3 children amidst organic gardening, milking goats, and preparing for the apocalypse. By 1980, Campbell had begun a career of piano tuning and repair. An inveterate activist through the 80s and 90s, she took a leadership role in the Arkansas chapter of the National Organization for Women, ran for school board and formed a parent-teacher group at her children's school, joined with other concerned citizens to stop a trash-burning incinerator, and founded an environmental action and education committee. In 1999, she began efforts to bring legalized medical marijuana to Arkansas, an effort which continues today under different leadership. In 2005, she retired from her piano career with retirement in mind. Alas, her dream of opening a tea room had her by the throat. And so from late 2008 through December 2011, she made that dream a reality with Trailside Cafe and Tea Room in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which was a delightful place. Finally, sanity prevailed. She has now blown up the road between her rural home and town in order to devote herself to writing, and we are the richer for that. Denele is here with us today to discuss the Back to the Land movement, Ozark history and memories. Please join me in welcoming Denele Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today, and thank all of you for coming. I don't know if I can beat that intro. I really am very almost embarrassed to talk about this book because it's not about me. It's about all these people that were willing to tell me their stories. I met them, almost about half of them, I'd say, through my piano tuning work. I was driving around northwest Arkansas, went to a lot of beautiful homes, churches, schools, but what captivated me the most were these people who were living in converted school buses and geodesic domes and shelters built into the side of a bluff. I mean, it was pretty amazing stuff. And I never could resist. I'd spend an extra hour after the tuning just asking questions, you know, how did you end up here? What are you doing here? What I saw were beautiful gardens and herds of goats and very eco-conscious methods of living, you know, trying things like solar panels before solar panels were even commercially available. A lot of people trying to make a living by doing traditional crafts like pottery. There was a big appreciation for all the arts, and these were mostly college-educated people that were out trying to scratch a living out of the ground. So by this time, the hippie alternative culture was about 20 years old. This was 80s and 90s, like I said. Their movement had been away from the cities, the things that we all remember about the 60s, the riots, the crowding, the racism, all the little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky. So what they came here for, pretty much universally, was seeking nature and privacy and the freedom to experiment with new ways of living. And actually, the Ozarks are one of the first places that the Back to the Land movement started to happen. There ended up being concentrations of similar cultures in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, and Washington State. A fairly sizable collection of folks in Colorado, some in Tennessee, and there were, of course, isolated places all over the country where like-minded people ended up. But the land here was cheap, relatively unspoiled, and, of course, gorgeous, as we all know, and all of those things were key elements for what these folks came for. They came from New York, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Houston, mostly from the east of here. This all fascinated me, and I kept thinking there needed to be some kind of record a history of it. You know, by this point, by the 90s, the mythology about the hippies had become pretty much stereotyped as dirty, selfish slackers, always stoned out, which was not what I was seeing at all. And it really started to make me mad. So I decided that I would try to collect these stories and set the record straight for the future. I wanted to do my part, but I didn't want to editorialize. I didn't want to get a bunch of data and write a cold, dry summary of numbers. So to me, the idea of just getting individual people's stories and presenting those stories was the way to make this what it needed to be. So I spent quite a bit of time and money over a 3 or 4 year period interviewing and transcribing and then printing and then researching potential publishers. I sent out query letters, sample packets to agents and publishers. Nobody was interested. So it ended up in one of my file drawers for about 15 years. Then 2 years ago, I woke up to the self-publishing world, and I thought, hey, here we go. So I put it out there, and I think the value, like I said, it's historical. I think future generations may appreciate it more than we can appreciate it now, because I see it as a cultural revolution. It took place quietly, it's still going on. Its results have not been fully felt or appreciated. And I did interview 60 people, but during that 15-year period, some of them moved away and I lost contact. Others decided, for whatever reason, that they didn't want their story told. But I ended up with 32 interviews, which, believe me, is a lot of material. And this is not a book that you can just sit down and read from front to end. You really have to give yourself time to absorb each person's personality and what their story is before you can break loose and move on to the next one. Let me say, some of the stereotypes actually kind of were true. For example, communes were a big popular idea. And I have one passage here that I'm going to read about this guy's experience with his commune. He was talked a long time. That was one of the hardest parts for me, was to edit out stuff that I didn't want to edit out anything. I couldn't print a 800-page book. We found this place down near Brentwood, 137 acres and a ranch-style house. We polled the room to find out how much money we had, and we didn't have anywhere near the down payment. The seller liked us so much that he split the place up into 120 acres in one part and the house on the remaining 17. We bought just the land. We needed $3,000 for that, and still, with a whole room full of hippies, we could not come up with more than $1,000. But I had a friend who had won a bunch of money on the who, what, and where game on television. And I called him, and he put in the other $2,000 so we could get the land. We formed a trust, and the trust bought the land. There were about 30 people living out there when we first got it. It's a beautiful piece of land. Timber hasn't been cut since the 1940s, so there are mature trees. One creek, 2 big draws. There was never a good well, so water was always a problem. Most everybody else we knew wanted to start a commune where everybody had the same ideas and would work together, share things, sleep together. The only part that we did was sleeping together, which caused a huge amount of trouble. Everybody there got divorced. Everything done was voluntary. It worked out really well. Eventually, all the communes split, and even though some of us ended up enemies, we still got that land. Everybody could do what they wanted to do as long as it didn't interfere with somebody else. That was about the only rule, besides coming up with the money each month for the payments, which was really only about $10 or $15 a piece. A big bunch of people came from Texas, a bunch from California, a bunch from Bentonville, a few from other places. A lot of the people who helped pay for the place never lived there. Some came, started to build, and went back to town. The people who were the happiest lived in teepees and Volkswagen buses. The people who are the most miserable built very ambitious, really good houses. I really don't know why they were miserable. Maybe it didn't have anything to do with the land. The ones with the least expectations had more fun. They didn't have steady jobs, didn't need any money to live the way they were living. It was a gypsy lifestyle. They'd go until they were absolutely hungry and then figure out how to get food stamps or make a few bucks, and then forget all about making money for a while. Eventually, I went back to town. I was the last one to live there. I went back and lived there for about 10 years after nobody else lived there. In fact, I lived there until just a few years ago. A dog lived there for a year after that, and I'd go out every day to feed my dog. She'd never seen a street and couldn't make it in town. A free dog from birth till death, a lonely hermit dog at the last. I'd like to go back. We would feel guilty about cutting a tree if it was a good tree, and we tried not to mess up the land. Still, we did. Nobody worked on any causes. It was so free to live out in the country. It was like living on another planet. People would hear about us, and for a while, groups of people would come out there and walk all over the place. We felt like we were in a zoo. They wanted to see the weirdos who were living out on the land in geodesic domes. His first job out of college was working for the FBI. Then he went to San Francisco and got his head screwed on, or off, depending on your point of view. A lot of these folks had never lived in the country and had no idea what they were doing. Here's an interesting little tale. When we got the land, we had the idea that we should change the world, the government. I took the idea that we needed to change ourselves, live a life that's honorable, respectful. Here in our life, what we do is what matters. The ones who wanted to go out, change the world, change how other people should live, I thought, what if everyone agreed? How would we live? The point is, we should be living that life. That's the example. That was the whole Back to the Land movement, living like we were supposed to live. Do little harm to the environment, try to live off the land, live simply. We were going to raise tomatoes when we came here. We planted 3 acres of tomatoes. Somewhere along the line, we decided there must be something wrong with the tomatoes. So we went to one of the old farmers out there, wondered what these young kids were doing down here. He came and he looked around and said, well, commercially this is worth 0. He said, you young kids would do a whole lot better growing yourself some pot. This was one of the old back hill guys that we thought if he knew we smoked pot, he'd probably kill us. What was amazing to me during this time was that we were coming in and there were lots of us. And there were these old folks, and this was during the time of the movie Deliverance. And we thought these old guys were going to be screaming or something. But they were the nicest people, salt of the earth, take you in. One of the neighbors gave us a cow. The first winter we were snowed in, and he came to the top of the hill and left us food. One of our guys had snow skis and would go up to get the food. We couldn't have made it without them. They would say how their kids were leaving and going to the city and they were left alone. And here are these kids coming back to the country, and they were more than willing to share what they knew with us. That particular man that gave this interview has become one of Fayetteville's most successful entrepreneurs. In another section of his interview, he gives a glimpse of how he learned about being in business. And this is when he was still in his hometown in a large city. Trying to not capitalize on other people's labor, exploiting the masses, that was another 60s value I adopted. But I quickly got over that. I'd started my own business, painting. Then somebody else wanted to work with me. And then I had several working for me. We had the attitude that we would all split the job. But I was the one buying the materials, the one with the ladder. I was the one who went out and got the jobs, made the bids, and it got to the point where I thought, there's something wrong with this picture. I was doing more work than anybody else, but everybody expected to share equally. So there was this argument about what's really work. Like, if I'm going out and getting the jobs, is that really work? They had this attitude that it's only work when you're painting. So finally I decided I was going to fire all you sons of bitches and do it myself. I said, okay, here's the way it is. You get so much an hour. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. I'll find somebody else. I finally realized the limitations of that sort of idea. I learned that what's fair is not always real clear. He's a hilarious guy. Stewardship of the land remains a high priority for these folks. This interview, really, this woman is amazing. I wish I could read her whole story. She came up here from Texas with a bunch of kids and a man with a lot of problems, and ended up living under a bluff, trying to survive. She still lives out on the land. This is a little bit about her land ethic. I'm a woman warrior for the creek. I've stood in front of the road grader and said, no, get out of here. You can run me down, but you're not doing this. They come in to grade the road, and they have this one method, and it doesn't work. I've watched the road for 20 years now, and I know what that road needs, and if they're not going to do it, I'd rather maintain it ourselves. We've maintained it for years. If we let them come down here into the holler, it's so fragile, you change it just a little bit, and it's changed for years. It's the Falcons Creek, and it enters into the Kings River. We're in the headwaters. It's pretty wild and woolly. There's times we have to hike out. We have a high water trail, and we park our car on the bluff, and it takes about a 15-minute walk to get down to the house because the creeks are roaring and we can't get in or out. A lot of what I think should be credited to this mindset and this generation, and I'm not saying that's just the people that moved here for the back to the land thing, but it's an ethic that has come more with this generation to care for each other and try to make things better in the world. This one particular woman was in nursing school in Boston. I had worked in a hospital in Dorchester, Massachusetts that was a maternity hospital. At that time, women were heavily medicated with twilight sleep, a combination of scopolamine, which is an amnesiac, and morphine, which is a narcotic. Women in labor are heavily dosed with these drugs. Their husbands nowhere to be seen, gone on another floor in a waiting room. Actually, women were in big wards, medicated by themselves, tied to the bed, hallucinating from the medication. It was like a snake pit. The worst horror story you could imagine. This was when I was 18, and this was my introduction to birth. I had a Catholic upbringing, and nobody told me about birth or even how to get pregnant, much less how to have a baby, even though my mother had 7 children. It was horrifying, a frightening experience. I felt like I was up against the wall watching all this happen. Oh my God. Women were screaming and yelling. They were hallucinating, not just because of the labor, but because they didn't know what was happening. Someone examines them but doesn't say anything. Nobody holds their hands. It was brutal, insane. At the time, I didn't understand that a big part of what was happening was because of the medication. I just thought, this is childbirth, and I am not going to do it. I'll never put myself in this situation, be humiliated, be treated this way. And because I had come from a big family, I had always thought that I would want to have a lot of children. Then 5 or 6 years later, I met a woman who had a baby at home, and she told me everything that happened, and it was the polar opposite. She was at home, relaxed. Her friends, midwife, and husband are with her. She tells me about nursing the baby. It was like, all right, this sounds better. This was long before I was ready to have a child, but just hearing about her experience really flipped me around. So without reading the next 6 pages, she went on to establish the first midwife school in Arkansas and has trained countless midwives to fulfill her idea, the ideal way of a woman having a child at home in a relaxed setting, and everybody loves her. I think she's retired from that now. Another early experience in life caused a guy to do some things in our area. He was from Kansas City. During college, I worked at Kroger's grocery store for 6 years. I was the head of a department, and part of the ethic involved for me was about the god-awful waste that happened in grocery stores. Kroger's had a policy that if there was one broken egg, you threw the other 11 away. If you had some ice cream melt, all the packages that were sticky got thrown away. If you had some moldy cheese, throw it away. If there was a broken carton of Mrs. Smith's cherry pie, throw it away. We couldn't just put it at the back dock. We had to open it and pour it down the drain. That really went against my grain. So he ended up buying land in Madison County. We've received a lot of awards for the recycling center we've set up for this county. It's been 9.5 years now. Keep in mind, this is 97 and 98 when I got these interviews. I had thought that after 10 years, if it's not getting better, I might not maintain it. But this is at least a generational thing. You're just constantly going back and saying the same things over and over to new people. Why you should do this, why we can take this but not that. My waste ethic is what I'm continually trying to teach people one-on-one. I firmly believe in that one-on-one. And that's what we have at the drop-off center. We see our customers every time they come in, and there's someone there to greet them. We ask them how they're doing, if they need help. We say, oh, I'm sorry, no, we can't take that. No, the caps have to be removed. Gentle reminder, we try not to nag. Constantly teaching them to do a little better. We're still making incredible progress. He goes on to talk about they've got VISTA workers and volunteers. They received a lot of state money. At this point, they've become kind of a model program, not only for Arkansas, but other states. Unfortunately, his ethic is hard to reproduce in a hired worker who doesn't have the passion that he has. Another one of the people that I interviewed was one of the founders of Ozark Natural Foods. When I first came, I opened a store in the old ice house located where the Walton Arts Center parking lot is now. We had a shop over there. We sold blue jeans for $2 and did that for almost a year, and then I got involved in the cooperative movement. It was right after a storefront got established, and the co-op wasn't sure what kind of focus they were going to take. I can remember them having gallons of mayonnaise and bulk mustard and roll-your-own tobacco. It wasn't nearly the focus of a natural food co-op that it is today. When I took over management, I felt we could get all this other food anywhere, or maybe pay a little bit more. What people really wanted was a place to buy natural and organic foods on a regular basis. So that was my focus as manager in the years that I ran the co-op. We started quite a big distribution network at that time. In 1974, we got a loan from somebody to buy 500 pounds of organic rice, and that was our first wholesale product. We started trucking that to New Orleans, and people in the country would come in and buy rice, and then we'd pick up honey. We started a small trading situation on a wholesale side, and that was the beginning of the Ozark Cooperative Warehouse. The year after that, we split into wholesale and retail operations. It was the idea of establishing wholesale natural foods in this area because no one else was doing it. We were trucking by pickup truck in the beginning. It was a social business trip. We'd go to New Orleans, have some fun, take a few bags of rice, pick up some honey. We tried to have fun at whatever we were doing, and because we were doing it with our own trucks and didn't have much overhead, we could do it. So this next story is a young man who had started out in pre-med, very ambitious, and pretty much killing himself in the process. Then he went into yoga and got very intensely into yoga, and I didn't know where he was going to end up, but he's ranting about subatomic particles and morphogenetic field, and so then I got into gardening when I tried to consider what would be a good alternative to medicine. I wanted to find something that I would feel good doing. I ended up sitting in my backyard saying, okay, universe, what is it I'm supposed to be doing here? Well, of course, I didn't get an answer. So after a while, I started pulling weeds, messing around in the yard, and then light spells and whistles started going off, and I realized this is my answer. But it was actually a year before I really understood, and then I connected. The very best food you can eat is what you grow yourself, coming straight from the earth, so full of life, and you have the added benefits of being out in fresh air and sunlight, working with the cycles of nature, and then there's all the airy-fairy kind of vibrational stuff. So I decided that's what I would do. And as I became more connected to the earth and experienced personal healing, more of the idea grew for me, this connection of all these things. And I don't even begin to think I understand it. The more I delve into it, the more I perceive. It's becoming more fun in a way, more wide open. It's exciting. I look around me and see that most people don't get it, don't see the connection between ourselves and the soil. They haven't been taught. In this country, we've become so removed from nature. He went on to do a newspaper column and a television show on Fayetteville Open Channel. But this is a sample of the kind of connecting with inner self that seems to be an underlying theme in all of these stories. And the last little excerpt I'm going to read, this guy was trained as an engineer and was very successful as an engineer. As we all know, engineers are a little weird. Without the 60s, I probably would have tried to live the life my parents lived. But generations being what they are, it probably wouldn't have fit. And I could easily imagine being in one of those situations where you talk about lives of quiet desperation. Given who I am, I probably would not have made the large leap, or at least not soon enough to save myself a lot of that desperation. Now I have a big set of possibilities to move through. Making music and dancing joyfully were always things I thought would be particularly wonderful, although a way to do it did not come out of my childhood. I watched the media, other people, other musicians, people who could dance. I had to watch those things from the outside until it came time to make a place for it. I was still married when I decided I had to learn to dance. We went to Arthur Murray's as a couple, which was a social experience unto itself. Neither of us could tolerate it. It was extremely contrived and alcohol dependent, and with some very strange people teaching ballroom dancing with a mirrored ball in a strip shopping mall at 5 p.m. So that didn't fit. But the need was still there. We kept looking and found traditional dancing. I was living in Little Rock at the time, early 80s. I went to one place they were dancing and put my nose in, and I distinctly remember what I saw, which was a bunch of people who weren't drunk, who were very joyfully dancing and did it without a mirrored ball and dark lighting. In fact, it looked just terribly normal. I thought, oh, this is pretty great. I didn't get to this point all on my own. I grew up with my father telling stories about dancing when he was a boy. When they danced in the front room, literally pushed the furniture back and rolled up the carpet. In their German community, they did schottisch, waltzes, live music, of course, at that time. So I had that in the back of my mind, trying to find expression. It sounded too great when he would reminisce about it. In my case, the dancing is an expression of idealism. People who are happy, people who have community, people who have village that I've never been able to experience in the rest of my life. People who like to do that are sometimes separated geographically but come together to dance. They have such a basic expression, a basic human expression in terms of music, joy, and movement, something that touches on such a basic human chord. It keys into all that idealism. So connecting to ourselves ultimately means that we can see the beauty and truth of everything around us. And it's this kind of quiet revolution that manifests itself in every possible way in our communities, whether it's yoga classes, urban gardening, Buddhism, folk dance, locally made tofu, progressive politics, recycled clothing stores. The Single Parent Scholarship Fund was established by one of these folks that I interviewed. There's a deep ethic of learning how to love yourself and then give that love outward. That for me was the powerful message that I wanted to share. We have this here. We've protected the Buffalo River. We've done a lot of things because of these ethics. And I'm the messenger. I've thanked these folks for sharing their stories, but I also thank them for everything that they've done, all their hard work. And I think we're all part of that community one way or another. Thanks for listening. Any questions?
I moved down here in '72. I'd been very involved with the anti-war movement and got tired of saying no and got tired of throwing my body in the way of things and being tossed in jail and whatever else was happening, and wanted to do something where I could say yes. And I had been in a community, gotten a divorce. Recreating community seemed like a way to say yes. And one of the interesting experiences is not long after we moved there, 3 women came to, I wanted nothing to do with the outer world. I was done. I was fried. And 3 women came to visit to talk to us about 2,4,5-T, that the Forest Service was spraying Agent Orange to kill the hardwoods and plant pines. And it was like the war had been brought directly into our woods and into our yard. And one of these women had lived on land with several women camping by a creek, and they had gotten an injunction that that area could not be sprayed. But the sheriff had been unwilling to serve the injunction, and so this land had been sprayed with all of those women there present. So this is one of the many stories from that time. But I found
this is the tip of the iceberg, really, of all the stories that need to be told.
I found out you couldn't really hide.
No.
Which the Buffalo River is teaching us over again.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to find out how many Back to the Landers have started institutions in this area that are things that we take for granted. The Botanical Garden is one.
Right. It's a long list.
It's a long list. This would be a really fun thing to know.
Well, I assign you that job.
I wanted to mention a very early Back to the Lander that all of you might not know about, although some of you know him very well, and that was William Ream Lighton of Lighton Trail and Happy Hollow School in Fayetteville. He published an article in the Saturday Evening Post about 1910 that was what was it called? The story of an Arkansas farm. And it was a really big deal, and then it was expanded into a book, and about 200 settlers came in response to what he wrote about taking over old beat-up, run-down farm run by a bunch of shiftless hillbillies. He's very outspoken in his contempt for the Ozarkers, but he took over this farm and made it into a kind of romantically successful place with a big fireplace and everybody sitting around and reading books, and then going out and picking a few things in the cool of the day. He went out to Hollywood and was trying to get in as a screenwriter, and then he got sick and came back and died. But his story is kind of an interesting early version. He wasn't exactly trying to go back to the land in the sense of the later generation, but it is part of the whole romance of the Ozarks, I think.
Well, it's good that you brought that up, because it's kind of the American dream in a lot of ways, to go to who was the guy? Now it's escaping my feeble mind. Not Emerson, but Thoreau, who had this same dream of going back to the purity of nature and communing with the natural world as a way of finding truth and beauty. And there have been multiple back to the land movements to some extent. I think one of the reasons that the 60s generation stands out, at least in my mind, is that it was the biggest one. And that's because it was the biggest generation. And because it was such a difference. I mean, in 1910, going to live in a cabin wasn't that far from what a lot of people were already doing. But in 1972, it was really different from the mainstream. But I suspect there'll always be that romantic concept of leaving it all behind and living the simple life.
In part because of Danielle's inspiration, I'm trying to answer some of the questions that you were just raising. And I'd say roughly every single person that moves back to the land in the Arkansas Ozarks is affiliated directly or indirectly with anything of note that emerges in the last 30 or 40 years around here. And so, I mean, if you think about it, that's at least like 8,000 people that are working actively, over the last 40 years to make this community what it is today. And Denele, I mean, she's given us those wonderful stories, and so so we thank you for that.
Well, I'm glad that you're going to do a book that takes a more.
This isn't about me; it's about you.
Well, but I can talk about you if I want to. His work through the university is to look more like he's got numbers. I don't have numbers. He just said 8,000. I don't know where he got that number, but I believe him.
I wouldn't. I mean,
But I gave him some leads when he first contacted me. I was so excited that somebody else besides me was interested in this subject, and he's done a great job. He's working on a book, and the U of A Press is working with him.
I don't know if I'm making this up or I really remember it, but when I moved here in the early 70s, it seems that there was a commune out around Pettigrew. Does that ring a bell?
I don't know of it personally, but there were a lot of communes. I mean, really, you couldn't throw a rock without missing a commune.
Do you want to say anything, Joy, about... Joy Russell is our Madison County historian, and so she was nodding her head when you said about Pettigrew. I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any memory, well, just from a native perspective, I am going to put you on the spot.
Well, I live at Witter in Madison County, and there was a big group that moved in to the Pettigrew area in the late 60s, and I knew a lot of the old-timers who were a little bit leery of them when they came. They first classified them as dopeheads and worthless people. But my experience is, including my father, who had some choice words to say about some of these people when he first saw them. But there was a couple of these young men that ended up working for my father, and he learned to love them. They lived in trees and tree houses and teepees, but I think all in all, they won over the people that had lived there for years, the old timers, because they love people, and they after people got acquainted with them, they accepted them, and there are still people living in Madison County that moved in here in the 60s and 70s that contribute a lot
Is that the same
to the
group
county.
that started the Headwaters School?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the old-timers loved about them was that they saw a kindred spirit in terms of love for the land.
It's the same across the Ozarks. It's not just Madison County. Every county where I've talked to anybody, it's a universal story. It's a universal story. And what some of them have told me, and that I've backed up through newspaper articles, is that they were seen almost as a surrogate generation because everybody was leaving the hills.
Yeah.
And so when these folks come in, like you were saying, and want to relearn and want to take part in living in the Ozarks, and that was a huge. I mean, there's some people that got in fights and houses were burned out, and things like we do in the Ozarks. But for the most part, I mean, it was a rejuvenation of the community, and so we can look at things like the Shiloh Museum or the Folk Center out in Mountain View, as a direct result of how they've developed as a direct result of this community and their reception by the locals.
In the early 70s, my husband and I and our young kids went out to Pettigrew and bought blueberry plants. We were going in blueberry business, and that's what the people were growing out there. So it might be parts of that same group.
Yeah.
A couple different times.
Have you ever interviewed any of the children of back to landers who are now adults?
Just my own. No, actually, that would be a very interesting project. You're hired. If you knew how many projects I have in the works right now, I'd have to live to be 150 to write even half of what I'd like to write.
Another piece of that is that the local women's movement grew out of the Back to Landers.
That's right.
The women got tired of doing so much of the work, and they started getting together on their own, and a lot of came out of that. Fayetteville, had the first battered women's shelter, and it became the the model for the whole nation to set up. And that came from many women who were part of the Back to Land movement with their husbands or men that they lived with. And then also the Ozark Natural Co-op and then the warehouse. Out of that, you know, the women got together and we wanted our own part. So we took over the trucking part and taught each other how to drive semis and run that as
Cool. I didn't
why
know
we
that.
picked the semis, I don't know, but we had a great time and great stories there. So that all came out also of the Back to Land movement as women themselves grew out of that role as traditional women, because they didn't have dishwashers or washing machines, but they were still doing all the laundry and dishes, and they realized this isn't right.
Yeah. I think it was the willingness to break the old rules, the old patterns, the old molds, and really try to create an authentic life by your own definition that, to me, has been one of the primary, can't think of the word, touchstones, I guess.
To me, what Diana said was, it was a real effort to say yes to something, and always to be, yes, we're building, we're not no,
Right.
even though there's still a lot of no saying to do.
Yeah, well, somebody's got to carry the torch in front of the parade, so here you go. You guys have been great. I really appreciate you coming out.
Fantastic. Go out and buy Denele's book, Nightbird Books. Support your local bookstore. Thank you, Denele Campbell. What an honor to have you here today.